I'm delighted to welcome Srini Venugopal to IIMA Ahmedabad. Srini is an assistant professor of marketing at the Grossman School of Business in the University of Vermont, which has a spectacular campus, as you see on Srini's slide. And it is also one of the few schools that focuses on sustainability in business. Srini's research lies at the intersection of consumption and entrepreneurship in subsistence marketplaces, which makes his research unique in marketing in a couple of respects. First, instead of viewing marketing from the lens of consumer behavior or firm strategy, Srini's research truly unravels marketing as an exchange between the firm and the consumer. And second, his research really strives to create real-world impact on individuals in subsistence settings through marketing. Now, this theme has consistently reflected in all of his papers that he's published in many major marketing and management journals. And I have been unabashedly a fan of Srini's work for the last 5 years, and I'm sure you will be too by the end of this talk. So Srini, welcome again to IIMA Ahmedabad, and please take over.
Thank you so much, Arun. Can you hear me?
Yes, perfect.
What a wonderful introduction. Just the ego boost I needed before a presentation. So my name is Srini Venugopal. As advertised on the slide, I'm a faculty member at the University of Vermont. And I've been looking forward to talking to all of you all week. Really thrilled to be here because Arun happens to be my academic sibling. So I was really thrilled to get this invitation from me. We share the same advisor. And before talking about specific research projects, I find it useful to start with the existential question. So I'll take a moment talking about my professional background prior to moving to academia, mainly because it has continuities with the research that I do now, the research program that I've been crafting over the last decade or so. What you see here on the screen are a list of items that you can buy for about $2, right? And most of us don't even think twice before purchasing these items. But there are close to 1 billion people around the world who live on less than $2 a day. And just like you and me, they have important needs like healthcare, education, food, and nutrition that they need to meet within these $2. The marketing world has done a brilliant job of catering to needs in context of affluence in rich marketplaces, middle-class marketplaces. But for me, the fundamental marketing challenge, the new frontier, is to be able to meet needs in context of poverty where people live on less than $2 a day. That would require us to radically rethink the way we create products as well as business models. So this is the broad challenge that has driven my professional life over the last decade and a half. Prior to moving to academia, I started a social venture in IIT Madras in a business incubator focused on providing education services in several low-income villages in South India. My venture used an affordable internet technology that could take education services, e-learning services to small villages in an affordable way and provide opportunities for students in those contexts to pursue higher education as well as employment opportunities. So I was running this venture for a few years, and in 2008, my venture was acquired by a large business group in South India. And since then, I've been researching the same phenomenon that I had exposure to as a practitioner, but in the capacity of an academic. So I moved back to academia, University of Illinois, and did my MBA and PhD there, where I started focusing on entrepreneurs in context of poverty. And I focused on two kinds of entrepreneurs. Entrepreneurs who are poor themselves and run survivalist enterprises, and social enterprises that originate in context outside context and enter context of poverty to create solutions there. And typically when I speak to my colleagues in the business school about entrepreneurs, it conjures up images like Steve Jobs or entrepreneurial hotbeds like the Silicon Valley. But most entrepreneurs in the world look like this on the right-hand side, and they operate survivalist businesses in the informal economy. And there is very little that we know about the lives of these entrepreneurs who are often at the front lines of meeting the needs of poor people around the world. Estimates suggest that there are close to 1 billion people around the world who are subsistence entrepreneurs. It accounts for about anywhere between 40 to 60% of the GDP in regions of the world like sub-Saharan Africa as well as South Asia. And there is very little that we know about these kinds of entrepreneurs. So the goal of my research has been to study these kinds of entrepreneurs and see what they can teach us in meeting needs in context of poverty. So I do research in South America, United States, East Africa, Uganda, and Tanzania, as well as in India and Australia as well. In a parallel stream of research, I also study social enterprises across diverse contexts. Being an engaged scholar, I continue to run an embedded social enterprise in several low-income communities in South India. You're seeing some of these images which are from the context where we run embedded social enterprises. And what the embedded social enterprises allow us to do is to study in a situated fashion the social problems that the community is facing. And in addition to doing research and publishing papers, cycle back some of the learnings to the community through the social enterprise. So what I've shown you so far gives you a glimpse into the topic of my research program, as well as my specific approach to it. That brings us to the project that I want to focus on today. And the title of the project is Fostering Inclusive Social Innovation in Subsistence Marketplaces Through Community Level Alliances. A quick shout out to my co-authors on this project, Gaurav and Gordon. Gaurav was a student at this, and Gordon is a professor at this, and I've learned a lot. It's truly a collaborative effort. The paper just got accepted last month in industrial marketing management, and it is now available for you to read, and I'll be happy to send a copy to you as well if you're interested. But the paper primarily focuses on the problem of elite capture in the arena of social innovation. Social innovation is broadly understood as any kind of effort that tries to solve a societal problem while making profits in the process, right? And that's the traditional understanding of it. And there are all kinds of approaches like the shared value creation approach popularized by Porter and others, coming primarily from an economics background. What these perspectives typically miss is the complexity of the local social environment. And that's what this paper tries to focus on. Let me first motivate the problem here, right? And the societal problem. So I told you that I run several embedded social enterprises. One of the communities in which I work is a small subsistence fishing community with about 300 households. The way of life in the community for generations has been when boys in the community become 8 or 9 years old, they drop out from school, they go in, on the boat with the elders in the community and learn traditional wisdom on how to navigate the sea to a particular spot to catch certain kind of fish. And if you talk to community members right now, many of them will say that because of climate change since about mid-2000s, the character of the sea has completely changed. You go to the same place in the sea using specific kind of wind, and you don't catch the kind of fish that you used to catch. Traditional wisdom has completely stopped working because of disruptive environmental change in these communities. And there are millions of such communities around the world that are dependent on nature for their very survival. And these are the kind of impacts of climate change that they are reeling under. So a typical shared value approach to this societal problem would be, let's see how we can boost incomes, right? Let's create a solution and airdrop the solution into the community to see how that might address the problem. And in the specific community that I'm talking about, there are social enterprises who have created GPS and imaging equipment like sonar that they are selling in the community to help fishermen navigate the sea, uh, view where fish are beneath the sea, and boost their catch, right? So this might appear like a creative solution to the problem. But when you start talking to community members, you find that most of the value created by this shared value approach is usurped by powerful members in the community. No subsistence community is a monolith. There is an income hierarchy. There are other dimensions on which hierarchy is created, like literacy levels, right? And that shared value approach, because of its genesis in economics, tends to neglect some of the complexities, social complexities in these kinds of communities. And what started happening in this particular community is that the rich fishers in the community were able to procure GPS and sonar because they can afford it and also because they can read English, whereas the poorer fishers in the community were unable to afford the same kind of technologies, which accentuated the prevailing inequalities in the community, right? So not only are they impacted by climate change, but the solutions for climate change have a disproportionate impact within the community, leaving poorer fishers worse off. So this is the problem of elite capture that this paper tries to address. And generally, the reason why this does not show up on our radar is because it doesn't arise out of malicious intent. It arises because of benign neglect, because we just don't know the complexities that exist in these local communities. So this is the challenge that we are trying to address in the paper. And what we suggest is creating inclusive social innovation that prevents the problem of elite capture of shared value created, requires that we don't airdrop solutions into the communities, but we embed within the communities by forging strong partnerships with key actors in the local community. In other words, how do we ensure that our solutions enmesh with the local socio-cultural realities? So we adopt the institutional work perspective in trying to address this. Whenever you're forging new partnerships in subsistence marketplaces, it's important to realize that social enterprises typically come from the formal economy. They are driven largely by formal institutional norms like property rights and contracts and contract enforcements, whereas subsistence marketplaces operate in the informal economy, where the key institutions that guide marketplace exchange are social norms, beliefs of the community, and so forth. So when you're forging relationships between these two entities, social enterprise coming from the formal economy and key actors in subsistence communities who reside in the informal economy from a different institutional environment, we have to create new kind of institutional infrastructure that guides these or governs these new relationships, right? And that's what the paper is focused on. The institutional work perspective builds on institutional theory. Institutions can be seen as rules of the game, right? The governance mechanisms that reduce uncertainty that is inherent to all social exchange. They can be either formal in the form of laws or informal in the form of informal community level norms. And institutional work perspective focuses on purposive and protracted efforts of key institutional actors in maintaining, disrupting certain institutional structures. So that's the theoretical perspective that we adopt in this particular paper. Let me, all right. So institutional work perspective is the theoretical lens or organizing theory that we adopt in the paper. Now, another shout out to the social enterprise cell in TIS, who really helped us access data. So the incubation cell in TIS works with several social enterprises. We selected 9 social enterprises representing diverse domains of business for this particular research. We tracked them over time. We did multiple longitudinal interviews with key actors in these social enterprises, typically the founders and In the first wave of data collection, we wrote up a case for each of these 9 social enterprises. And the reason we selected diverse social enterprises from domains like skill development, rural, agriculture, food, poultry, is because we wanted to ensure that the themes and insights that we generate are not embedded within the idiosyncrasies of a specific domain of business. So after writing up the case from the first wave of data collection, second wave of data collection, we started gathering data that was theory driven. By that time, we knew that the focus of the paper was going to be institutional work and the institutional infrastructure that these social enterprises are creating to govern the relationships with key actors in the local communities. So we started doing theory-driven interviews in the second wave of data collection. We also accessed multi-format data. We went through the websites. All of these social enterprises had websites, annual reports. They were covered by media. So we looked at newspaper articles written by third parties on the activities of these social enterprises. And the multi-format data also helped us get a sense of or triangulate across different perspectives. So that was the methodology adopted for the paper. We also examined marketing collaterals created by these enterprises. Our original sample frame, was more than 30 social enterprises, but there were certain key criteria that we used to reduce it to 9 social enterprises. Like these social enterprises should have been operational for at least 2 years so that we can glean enough information, or we'll have enough information about them that we can analyze. The second one was we only focused on social enterprises that were for profit. And we also wanted to ensure that we represented social enterprises across different domains. That led to the final list of 9 social enterprises that you can see on the screen, and you'll see more details on the kind of data that we analyzed in the paper, which I'll be happy to send across to you. So before walking you through the findings of the paper, let me give away the punchline, right? So the problem I told you was, Arun, you have a question? Please go.
Yes, Srini. So I have a question on the previous slide. So I wanted to know if there is any diversity in the way these social enterprises created their or developed their solutions. The reason I asked that question is because if you are wanting to understand how social innovations should be embedded in the community versus solutions being airdropped, then did you select these enterprises because you saw some variation in the way these solutions were developed, some with more participation of the community and some with less? Or was there some other motivation for you to select these enterprises?
Absolutely. So the first part, the first wave of data collection, that's when we wrote up the case studies in all of these social enterprises. And when we analyzed that, we looked particularly for social enterprises that were able to create this, attend to the complexities of the social environment that they're operating in. The question there that you're getting at is an important one. Are we sampling on the DV? Are we only selecting social enterprises that have done a good job? I think that's a very important point for me to elaborate on. That goes back to what the unit of analysis for the paper is. The unit of analysis for the paper is not social enterprises. It's particular strategies that social enterprises use in operating in certain communities. So that's, we spend a significant amount of time in the paper talking about that. So what we found was the same social enterprise had different kinds of approaches in operating in one context versus another. In one context, they succeeded. In another context, they failed. So that variance helped us theorize what factors worked well. That was crucial. Another important source of variation was variation across time. I told you that we selected social enterprises that had operated at least for 2 years. What that means is we were able to get historical data where the organization had learned And they said, a year back, we tried this strategy, but it did not work for this reason. But now we are doing it this way, which is working for us for this reason. So the source of variation that we are tapping into is not at the level of the firm or the social enterprise. It's on the level of strategy of the social enterprise across different communities. And we use variation across communities or across space, as well as across time. Thank you. That was an important question. I glossed over that.
Can I ask a follow-up question on that?
Sure, please.
So, which means your observation is actually this classification that you mentioned and year level, is it? It's a combination of that, or so at what unit is the observation then?
So the observation is at the level of specific projects and communities.
And when you just now mentioned that you have classified it,
Mm-hmm.
So is the classification, so how is this classification done then?
So the classification is across time and space. So the same social enterprise might say that in this community, we used this particular strategy, but in another community, we used a different strategy. And then they talk about, so this is qualitative research. And so they talk about it in the interviews and all the annual reports and things like that. There's several sources of data that we tapped into. So variation across space, which is to say across different communities, as well as variation across time, which is within the same community, but different strategies across different time periods.
So which means that the same sector in a different time point can actually appear in a different strategy classification.
Absolutely. I think thinking quantitatively, I think what you're saying is absolutely on.
Okay. Oh, okay. Then I'll wait. I'll not jump the gun. I have another question, but I'll wait for you to talk about the methodology and then.
Sure.
Thank you so much.
Thank you so much for that question. So just to give the punchline away of the paper, the goal of the paper is to remove the threat of elite capture and foster inclusive social innovation, right? So in the paper, we develop 3 mechanisms. The first one we call relational work, which is about creating shared value. The second mechanism we call inclusion work, which is about inclusive distribution of shared value. The third one we call equity work, which is about fair distribution of shared value. Let me quickly walk you through the definitions of these 3 process constructs, and then I'll walk you through some theoretically revelatory micro mechanisms within each of these processes. So relational work is creative weaving together of local stakeholder relationships to bring into place a mutually valuable exchange where none existed before. So this is a foundational process that enables the creation of shared value by signaling to all stakeholders that maximizing self-interest alone is not the governing principle of the stakeholder network. So this is what institutional theory helps us theorize. The second one is inclusion work, which we define as the orchestration of microprocesses necessary to bring about marketplace inclusion of groups that are historically excluded. So systemic marketplace exclusion are always situated and could be based on factors such as gender, class, race, based on whichever society you're operating in. Equity work deals with the creation of relationships and routines necessary to ensure that shared value is equitably distributed across all intended stakeholders and not across several rent seekers, which I'll talk about as we go along. So this is a thumbnail sketch of the findings as a whole. And I'll now dig deeper into each of these mechanisms and talk about certain micro mechanisms that challenge some of the taken for granted assumptions in the literature. So our data analysis followed the Goya methodology. We created first order concepts that were rooted in contextual idiosyncrasies. Slowly, we collapsed them into more abstract second order themes, as you can see, all of which aggregate into broader constructs like inclusive social innovation. Another thing you will notice is all the constructs in the paper are process constructs, which is a characteristic theme of institutional work perspective, which doesn't study states, but it studies flows or processes for creating certain kind of institutional infrastructure. Let's start first with relational work. If you scan quickly the literature on social innovation, you will find that the social enterprise is always depicted in these heroic terms, as though, and local communities are typically depicted as communities waiting with bated breath for external social enterprises to come in and help them, right? What we found in the data was tremendous amount of distrust of external actors, particularly those who were coming in saying that they were going to help the local community. Any business actor who says, I'm here to make a profit, they are legitimized within the local context because there is a way for us to understand those kinds of actors. But when you come in saying, I'm here to help while also making a profit, that's a new hybrid category, which is not easily legitimized within local communities. And we found local communities to be proactive gatekeepers who challenged social enterprises who were trying to come in. Right. So the kind of quotes that we would often see, and this is from another project that I worked on, a social enterprise that works on women's empowerment. When they gathered the women for a discussion, a lot of men in the community started protesting, saying that, do you people work for the white folks, right? Questioning their intentions. And in context with a colonial history, distrust of outsiders is pretty normal. And the same thing is true if you're working with indigenous communities in Australia, for example. Outside researchers and outsiders have come in and depicted them always based on their weaknesses, right? And so they're always threatened by outsiders coming in saying that we are here to help you. They're proactive gatekeepers. And we found that social enterprises tried to gain legitimacy through association, which is to say that you go and talk to a traditional leader in the community who's seen as a legitimate actor locally, or you go and talk to an elected representative who's also seen as a legitimate entity locally. If you're able to convince them, initially during the entry stage, they operate as a conduit for you to enter and operate within the community. So you get legitimacy through association. It's not easy to enter and operate in these contexts. The second important one was the paper is about relational work, right? That's one important facet. India has 600,000 villages. There are villages, particularly in the Northeast, which are very difficult for us to access because of the hilly region. How do we create relationships in these kind of communities? We found a lot of social enterprises using technology. So one social enterprise called Rovenost, it's a telemedicine healthcare-based social enterprise, which uses telemedicine as a way of reaching patients in small villages in far-flung areas in India, so that doctors from bigger towns and bigger cities are able to deal with patients and also track medical history of these patients, so that your prognosis and your diagnosis is based on not just one interaction with the patient, but based on medical history of these patients. So that's one theme that came out within relational work. The second one is when you're forging relationships with key actors in the local community, there is an important question of where do you locate oneself? So we studied a social enterprise that works on waste management, and they work with a lot of rag pickers in local communities. They found that initially they started working with about 150 waste pickers in small communities, and they found that there were local aggregators whom they were displacing by directly working in these communities. If you were only focused on profit maximization, it made financial sense for them to work directly by disintermediating these local aggregators. But because they were a hybrid organization focused both on making social impact as well as financial impact, they started working with the pre-existing business ecosystem within these communities. So there is an important issue that one has to be concerned about, which is where do you locate yourself within the local business ecosystem so that you don't disrupt these pre-existing ecosystems. The third one is
Srini, can I interrupt you? I had a quick question. So
sure.
I find the finding that technology plays a bridging role between the social enterprise and the community to be fascinating. So do you actually have, in your data, does your data suggest that technology is kind of or the distance communication technology is giving more legitimacy to the social enterprises, or is it increasing trust that community would have towards these social enterprises versus these social enterprises meeting them face to face?
Technology in this particular case is, I don't think technology is the driver. It is about how technology is used. A lot of times you will just bypass some of these key actors, right? And we only look at the technological link and we don't pay attention to the human chain that underlies the technological link. So if you're using mobile phones, there is probably a local retailer who's helping you navigate through the mobile phone, even though you cannot read and write. That person is helping you get the doctor on your mobile phone, things like that. So I don't think it is about the technology itself. And that is where I think one can dig a little deeper to understand how technology, in the processes that you put around technology, the routines that you put around technology, can ensure that we don't leave any of the local stakeholders outside, because many people might not be able to use technology, or also pay attention to the key catalysts, human catalysts in these local communities that allow people to benefit from this technology. So I gave you the example of GPS and fishers using GPS. A lot of older fishers cannot read and write. What do? They go to the younger members in the fishing community who can help them use the GPS, because they are able to go to school and they're able to decode what the GPS or the sonar is saying. So they rely on social capital within the community. So if you only focus on the technology and not the processes or routines that shape the usage of the technology, we might be missing much of what is truly transformational about technology there.
So I think what I'm hearing you say is that technology almost compels the involvement of a mediator, and in a certain way, it kind of that way it acts as a bridge, because it is involving local community more, or opinion leaders more, than a face-to-face communication would have.
That's right. So involving people as well as creating new kinds of routines that that envelop the use of technology. That's right. And so remaining with the issue of relational work, with Rovenost, which is a healthcare or telemedicine social enterprise, one thing they came out is traditional healers. What do you do with traditional healers in small communities? Do you see them as competition, or do you see them as collaborators? So Rovenost saw them as collaborators because these people have relational capital with patients in local communities. Why sideline these people? Why not harness their social capital? At the same time, they also provided training and tried to provide training and education to some of these local traditional health practitioners. So they were not blind to some of the problems that arises from traditional health healers. At the same time, they did not see the issue as being one of just conflict or just collaborate. So they attended to this duality of local players like traditional healers. The second important dimension is inclusion work. So let me take another breath there and see if there are any questions. I did rush through some of these things very quickly. So let me pause and see if there are any questions, folks. Feel free to unmute yourself and chime in if anybody has questions. I'll keep moving on. So inclusion work, like I mentioned before, is about proactively bringing into the sphere of the marketplace actors who have been systematically excluded. And this could be based on gender, this could be based on caste. It is very common for for-profit enterprises to only work with actors who are already in the realm of the marketplace, right? And let me give you an example of Even Cargo. Even Cargo distributes products of e-retailers like Amazon. And they do that not just in big cities, but also in tier 3 towns. And they explicitly try to recruit delivery partners from excluded groups. So in a particular community, they recruited a lot of women who were from a particular caste who historically engage in manual scavenging, right? And girls in the community are not allowed to go out and work. And Even Cargo tried to proactively recruit girls from these communities to provide them a dignified opportunity to work and also make an income that they can use to pursue higher education. And when we're going through or analyzing Even Cargo's case, what we found was we thought there would be other actors in the community who will resist this effort of including this group, which has been hitherto excluded. But what we found was the biggest source of barrier was the girls themselves internalizing social roles, right? So many of them said it's not for girls to go out and work, riding bikes and things like that. So the key thing that they had to work on is not work on parents, is not work on other important players in the community, but working with the girls in the community and helping them see this as a legitimate livelihood option for them. They faced a lot of challenge in doing this, and the way they resolved this was by using role models. Many of them had never seen a girl riding a bike and delivering packages, so they used some of their early delivery associates who were girls. And once the girls started seeing these delivery associates delivering packages in the community, they pointed to them and used them as role models to go and question this taken for granted assumption in the community that girls cannot be doing this job. So that was really crucial for them to change the mindset of the girls themselves. Once they achieved that, it was about working with other institutional enforcers, the usual suspects, parents who say, I don't want my girl child to be working outside and things like that. A typical business firm will only work with actors that they are trying to recruit. But a social enterprise like this, which is trying to bring about inclusion, has to go door to door and convince parents or husbands or other key enforcers of institutional norms to try and change their mindset as well. So Even Cargo had to invest a lot of resources to achieve that, which is an important departure from how purely for-profit firms enact this kind of work. The third one is expecting backlash. A lot of girls who started working for Even Cargo started talking about the backlash that they were facing, physical violence, some of them. Whenever you question or challenge legitimized social roles, you can expect backlash. And one way of approaching this is not acquiescing and not changing anything at all, but firms, social enterprises like Even Cargo expected this kind of backlash and they put in place mechanisms. So for example, they empowered their women delivery associates to not deliver a package if they detected a threat in an environment, right? So if you didn't feel safe in a particular house, you don't have to deliver the package. They also created an app which with a panic button, which you could press and immediately there will be a team that will be dispatched to help these kinds of delivery associates. So expecting backlash and putting in place mechanisms to deal with the backlash helps bring about some of these institutional changes. So that was about inclusion work. We focused primarily on Even Cargo to focus on gender-based inclusion work, but based on which context you're operating in. If you're operating in the United States, the dimension of exclusion that will be relevant there might be race, right? So it's really contextually situated. The third important mechanism that I want to talk about is equity work. Once you've included groups that have been historically excluded, you now have to talk about how the value pie is going to be sliced up and divided. What's the equitable distribution of the value pie? And there are different kinds of rent seekers in subsistence context who might usurp part of the value that is created without having participated in the process of shared value creation. One common example is corruption. This quote is from a waste management firm that was dealing with the issue of local government officials asking for bribes, right? So much of the shared value that the firm social enterprise was creating was usurped by key government officials in the local context, and they had to invest a lot of resources to create awareness for this, work with local media to push back against these kinds of practices. So this is an example of corrupt governance, government officials usurping part of the value. It could also exist in other forms. So this is Miraculous Millets that works with marginal farmers, helps them switch to millets farming, connects them to markets, tries to boost their income. And what they found was a lot of aggregators, because many of these farmers had low levels of literacy, would cheat them by weighing their bories or their sacks less and reporting that this is 18 kgs when it was actually 20 kgs. So this also leads to value leakage in the system, and actors who should not be getting part of the shared value who end up usurping that. What Miraculous Millets did was put in place technology that would allow even people who've never been to school to weigh their produce to ensure that this exploitation tendency that exists in the system can be combated by key participants in the community. And another mechanism that I wanted to bring up, because this was interesting, is we often think about privilege and hierarchy in static terms, right? So in the United States, for example, white African American, we see whites as being more privileged in general, universally, and across time. In India, we would see caste hierarchy, Brahmins being more privileged and powerful than other groups occupying lower rungs in the caste hierarchy. This is from Miraculous Millets again, that was working with several farmers in a low-income community, all of them marginal farmers, some of them from lower caste, some of them from upper caste like Brahmins. And what they found was many of the Brahmins were unwilling to embrace cultivation of millets, even though they stood to gain from switching. And the reason is many of the Brahmins saw this as this is something that only lower caste folks do. We don't cultivate millets, right? So historically speaking, this is a privileged group, a more powerful group that was engaging in behaviors that in the long run was not in its own interest. So what Miraculous Millets did was engage in a campaign to educate the Brahmins, saying that you stand to gain a lot more by embracing these kinds of new cultivation practices, because the prices you'll get in the market will be way higher. So it is not always a question of working with scheduled caste or scheduled tribes. In India, one might take that for granted, but there could be situated equity issues that you have to pay attention to, and sometimes group that you might see as being more privileged and powerful might be suffering from certain kinds of problems. The same thing is true in the United States as well, with working class white folks in Appalachia, for example. And people often say that that's ignoring working class white people was the primary reason that led to Trump's rise in the previous election, right? So this was another important issue that I wanted to bring up. So I'll stop there, and I'm happy to have a discussion on the paper or any other aspect of my research program. I'd particularly love to hear from PhD students if they're around, if they have any questions on this kind of work in general or specific aspects of this paper.
Sir, good evening, from the Indian time zone. Very interesting work. I was very interested in, how you guys would have introduced technology to, the people. So we are also doing a little research on, mobile banking technology adoption amongst the rural people.
Mhm.
And so would request you to share how this, miraculous millets or any other of these people, how they solved this problem, because this is a huge problem.
Right.
A lot of people come with a lot of historical mindset, and they are not willing to use technology itself.
Right. I think that's absolutely true. And I think it goes back to what Arun asked earlier as well. And the problem arises because we tend to just look at the technology product alone and not look at the human network that operates around the technology. So SBI, State Bank of India, they had their banking correspondent model and things like that, with people with handheld devices going around to small villages to provide banking services. Although we focus on the handheld devices, we don't focus much on the people who ensure that they are making that contact with the person and helping them or assisting them in using the technology. So one thing we often miss is people who bridge cognitive distance, not just physical distance. Technology helps us deal with the physical distance, but how do you deal with cognitive distance? Let me give you an example of that. In the small fishing community that I was talking about, the government sector banks provide them loans at a much cheaper rate than the local loan sharks provide, right? But consistently, community members will go to the local loan shark. You might think that this is just an information issue, maybe they don't know. But when you go and talk to them, they'll say, I'm completely aware of the fact that banks provide much lower interest rate. But they'll say that banks are for rich people and educated people. That's not for people like us. We don't feel welcome there. What do they do? The first thing that you're greeted with is a form, and if you're illiterate, you don't feel like that is a place where you belong. So it is not just the physical distance, but the cognitive distance that needs to be bridged as well in usage of technology also. And there are key actors in the local community who help bridge that gap, who often go unnoticed. That happens with mobile phone use as well. People who have low levels of literacy benefit from mobile phones because there are others in the household or in the community who help them figure out how to use and benefit from mobile phones. So I would study technology in conjunction with key human actors who allow for the adoption and the embrace of that technology, and also the new kinds of practices that emerge within the community that allows for people to derive value from the technology.
Thank you so much, sir. Thank you.
Thank you.
Srini, there's something I'd like to mention here for the benefit of PhD students. I mean, I see one or two familiar names. So I would like to draw the attention of PhD students to the way Srini presented this research. I think it's an excellent example of how qualitative research can be presented. Because I personally, in the qualitative papers that I have worked on, have always found presenting the research challenging, because there's this apprehension that the narratives that are so close to your heart may seem very boring to the listener. So this was very, very interesting, very engaging. And I think this is an example that all of us who do qualitative research can really learn from. So I had a question for you, Srini, for my benefit and for the benefit of other PhD students here. So you said you were tracking these enterprises for 2 years. So you did have a paper in mind at some point. So when did you decide that this can be fashioned or this can be crafted into a paper? And what made you choose institutional work perspective as the enabling theory? How did you get that idea?
Sure.
At what point? At what point in the research journey did you get that idea?
Absolutely. That's always a problem with qualitative research. Like you mentioned, if you want to get published in our discipline, it has to be theoretically robust, right? But when you're doing qualitative research, what really excites you is hearing the voices of people whose voices are generally not captured, and privileging those voices. So how do you marry these two goals of being able to hear these voices and also crafting it in a way that is compelling theoretically and would find a home in our academic journals? What I have started doing is, in order to balance these two things, is with qualitative research in particular, is break down the project into two parts. The first part is completely devoted to understanding the context, capturing voices of the most marginalized members of the particular community. The second part is when I start discovering areas for deep theoretical drive. So the first wave of data collection was done by Gaurav. And when I looked at the data, I found that institutional work was written all over it. There was institutional theory has been dealing with the problem of embedded agency for the longest time. And what we were seeing in that data was tantalizing glimpses of organizations changing local institutional environments in a way that was conducive to enhancing well-being. So that's very exciting as an institutional theorist. But we had not asked enough theory-driven questions in the first wave, because it was phenomenon-driven, to do justice to the task of creating a paper and publishable paper. So the second wave was going back to the institutional theory literature, figuring out what we already know and what we don't know, and creating a questionnaire or interview guide that we could go back to our informants and do a theory-driven deep dive interview. And that is when this paper actually becomes amenable to being published in an academic journal. I tend to do that in cases where it is difficult to do longitudinal work. I tend to split the sample. So if you do about 50 interviews in total or 40 interviews in total, the first part tends to be discovery oriented, where you're focusing on understanding the phenomenon. By then you have an inkling that this is the theoretical angle that is really interesting. So you go back to that theoretical literature, you find major gaps that you will be able to speak to if you conducted a deep dive examination of that particular theoretical issue in your context. And the remaining 20 or 25 interviews, you focus on deep dive theoretical dive. So I think that really helps balance these two goals of staying true to the phenomenon, at the same time crafting a paper that is theoretically compelling to a much broader audience.
Thank you. Thank you very much. So it's almost like boundary spanning methodology to start with grounded theory and then moving on to choosing an enabling framework or enabling theory and then doing theory-driven work. So thank you very much for that informative answer. So we'll wait for another couple of minutes to see if there are more questions. And then I think we can conclude thereafter. Are there any questions for Srini?
Can I ask, please? So qualitative research is not my area, so pardon my ignorance, if any. So I'm just trying to understand. While I understand the intent when you say that the observation is at a strategy level and not the firm level.
Right.
Typically in empirical research, we still absorb away the fixed effects, which are the idiosyncratic effects due to the firm, so that we can attribute it to the strategy. So I'm just wondering, how did you do that here so that you can cleanly attribute this to strategy and not the firm level idiosyncrasies?
Absolutely. So I showed you the coding structure, right, which is a hierarchical structure of order 1 themes, order 2 themes. What I did not show you is order 0 themes. So first time when you're coding data, you have hundreds of highly specific to the context kind of codes, right, which you find that that's only applicable to the domain of agriculture. It doesn't work for healthcare. So those kind of codes in the analysis process tend to fall by the wayside because you're unable to put them into cogent, abstract, theoretical categories. You're not unable to collapse them. So that's the way you get rid of variation that is idiosyncratic to a particular domain of business, and that is not shared across different domains of business. It happens in the coding structure that I showed you. But what I did not show you also is the level 0, which becomes very messy if you put that in a paper, where you literally have hundreds of codes, many of them idiosyncratic, that don't eventually make it to the paper because those insights are not generalizable across diverse domains of business.
Thank you.
Really, there's a question from Santosh. So Santosh is asking if you can elaborate what theory-driven questioning is, and how did you actually, the nuts and bolts of it, how did you actually use it in the paper?
Sure. So I'll give you an example based on a project that I did with women entrepreneurs. So I did this research a while back where I was talking to, where I followed about 25 women entrepreneurs over multiple years. And most of these women entrepreneurs were in a small urban low-income neighborhood in what we might call a slum. And one of my informants told me that, she considers herself lucky if she gets $10 net income per month, right? Which is not a lot of income, even in that context. So I asked her, why do you put in so much effort? She runs a bottled pickle business. Why do you put in so much effort for just $10 a month, net income per month? And she said, this is the first time I have money in my hands that I can spend in any way of my own choosing without relying on my husband. I can, buy a chocolate for my son or daughter. It's changed the way I look at myself and what I think I'm capable of. I always thought the only thing I can do is housework, right? So what that gave me a sense of was this phenomenon that we were witnessing was not about creating financial growth. It was more about changing the mindset of the individual. So she was using entrepreneurship as a site to change her view of herself, right? So that was the first part, which was phenomenon driven. Then we went back to institutional theory that tells us that if you're institutionalized within a certain institutional environment, it shapes the way you look at the world and you understand your position within it. And it says that if institutions govern the way you understand your own role in the world, how is it possible for an institutional actor to make changes to that or act in agentic ways that deviate from the institutionally derived script? So we stumbled on this important theoretical notion of embedded agency. There have been several papers written on explicating what embedded agency is, how it is difficult to address. So we found a theoretical angle, went back to institutional theory literature and dug deeper into that issue. And then we started doing interviews that were focused on understanding how these women were exercising agency. So the entire line of questioning revolved around just that one issue of embedded agency, and everything else that we had focused on in the previous round of data collection was put into the back burner. So that's how you move from, so in the first wave, we didn't have this notion of embedded agency as well when we were interviewing our informants. But in the second wave, we had our theoretical lens by then, the angle that we wanted to focus the paper on. We went back to the literature and we created questions that would help us understand how these women were making embedded agency possible when the literature says that there are all kinds of barriers that prevent it from happening.
Okay, Srini, so it is 6, and I think it's time for us to conclude. Thank you very much for accepting our invitation. And thank you for sharing your research. It was a very, very interesting talk. And I'm not just saying that because, I have to say it, but it truly was interesting. And people judge research in different ways. The way I usually look at research is how many ideas could I generate by reading a paper or by listening to a talk. And I could get many new ideas, many fresh ideas hearing your presentation. So thank you very much, Srini. It was truly enjoyable, and we hope to see you again. We hope to see you present your next research at IIMA Ahmedabad. Thank you.
Absolutely, and hopefully in person.
Yes.
Next year. It's been wonderful talking to all of you. And if you're ever in my neck of the woods, Northeastern United States, send me an email. I'll be happy to organize a research seminar if any of you happen to come there. Wonderful talking to all of you. Thanks for the opportunity.